Hello, my name's Ennead I, and this is the third in a series of videos I'm calling Walking the Platonic Path, introducing the philosophy of the Platonic tradition. And this third video I've entitled Being and Beyond. In the second video of this series, I particularly examined the Delphic exhortation, know thyself, and this was for the ancient Platonists the necessary starting point to philosophy. It's a difficult task. One of the truths we uncovered is that for the Platonic tradition, the self is the soul. And that's a difficult thing to get to know. There is, of course, a kind of modern pursuit of discovering oneself, but that tends to be a discovery of all the attachments that we make, whether that's genetic, cultural, family, the responses that just living the life embodied, so to speak, calls us to make. But for the Platonic tradition, the self is the soul, pure and simple, and that's an elusive thing to discover. So, a difficult task, but not the only difficult task that faces us at the beginning, because if we discover the nature of something, that is not good enough. We also have to discover the good of that something. In our case, if we begin to discover our own nature, we are immediately beset with questions about what purpose, what good should we be turning ourselves towards. And if we're going to look at ourselves and our life in that light, then we must know what the good is. This is the very question that Socrates introduces in Book 6 of the Republic. Up until this point, the characters exploring the various philosophical questions of the Republic have been in search of justice in particular, but also the other virtues which constitute the good of an organism, whether that's a city-state, which is on the surface what the Republic is about, or the nature of the soul, that organism of the soul with all its powers and activities. This is what we've been in pursuit of. What are its virtues? But Socrates introduces the idea of the good as being the key to understanding and using those virtues. This is what he says. This, I rather think, since you have often heard at least that the idea of the good is the greatest discipline, which idea, when justice and the other virtues employ, they become useful and advantageous. You now almost know that this is what I mean to say, and besides this, that we do not sufficiently know that idea, and that without this knowledge, though we understood everything else in the highest degree, you know that it is of no advantage to us, in the same manner as it would avail us nothing, though we possessed anything whatever, without the possession of the good. Or do you think there is any greater profit in possessing all things without the possession of the good, than in knowing all things without the knowledge of the good, knowing nothing at all that is beautiful and good? This is a simple but profound point that Socrates makes. No possession, whether inner or outer, is useful to us unless we know the good towards which it should be directed. The tear-stained pages of history show over and over again that all the advantages that anyone possesses, whether that's wealth or power, fame, knowledge, talents, strengths, no matter what they possess, that can actually undermine the person if he or she doesn't direct it towards the good, and undermine their lives. In fact, every well-constructed tragedy turns not on some unexpected external misfortune arriving, but upon that very thing, the advantage, the great strength of the protagonist turning, so to speak, in the hand and undermining the hero or heroine. So, what is the good? Since, as I pointed out in our second video, all the decisions we make are actually based upon our understanding of what good will arise from any particular option, we must surely know what the good is, don't we? There's the problem. And Socrates, a few lines later in the Republic, has this to say. Well, isn't it clear that many people would choose things that are believed to be just or beautiful, even if they are not, and would act, acquire things, and form beliefs accordingly? Yet no one is satisfied to acquire things that are believed to be good. On the contrary, everyone seeks the things that are good. In this area, everyone disdains mere appearances. This, then, is what every soul pursues, and for its sake does everything. The soul has a hunch that the good is something, but it is puzzled and cannot adequately grasp just what it is, or acquire a stable belief about it that it has about other things. And so it misses the benefits, if any, that even those other things may give. So, anything that governs must know the good above all other things. Whether that government is of the self, or a great state, or anything in between, knowledge of the good is essential. And the clearer and more stable that knowledge is, the more able is the governance. We need to be clear here. What we're saying is that the knowledge must be of the good, not of a particular good. In just the same way that if we want to judge whether a door is red, we must know what redness itself is. Or whether an instrument has played a major chord, we must know what constitutes, in general, a major chord. So, a third important affirmation to go with the two I mentioned last time in the second video, which was that the self is the soul, and that the soul has a relationship to the body of user to instrument. A third important affirmation is that the soul, as a governor, must, as far as humanly possible, know the good. And we can see from the passage I've just read that there is a further concern that we must know what it is in reality rather than its appearance. And indeed, whenever we explore anything, what we're looking for is the reality of the thing, not the appearance. In a way, looking at it from a slightly different angle, what we're looking for is knowledge rather than belief. Knowledge, of course, is true, whereas belief can be true or false. These two issues are raised over and over again in the writings of Platonic philosophers. One of the clearest statements of this doubled question of reality and appearance and knowledge and belief is made by Timaeus at the beginning of his great cosmological speech in the dialogue which bears his name. He says, "In the first place, therefore, as it appears to me, it is necessary to define what that is which is always real being, but is without generation, and what that is which is generated indeed, or consists in a state of becoming to be, but which never really is. The former of these, indeed, is apprehended by intelligence in conjunction with reason, since it always subsists according to same. But the latter is perceived by opinion in conjunction with irrational sense, since it subsists in a state of generation and corruption, and never truly is." The view that being and knowledge are two sides of the same coin of reality, and that seeming and belief are the equivalent two sides to the flux of the material world, can be traced back at least as far as Parmenides and his poem on nature, which of course we now only possess in fragmentary form. In the poem, the young man who's searching for truth is taken before an initiating goddess who explains to him that there are two paths, the way of truth and the way of seeming. And this is what she says about the way of truth. "The same thing is there for thinking and being. And look upon things which, though far off, are yet firmly present to the mind, for you shall not cut off what is from holding fast to what is." But having outlined the way of truth, she concludes and moves on to the way of seeming when she says, "Here about truth firm thoughts and reasonings end. Opinions human now attentive learn, clothed in fallacious ornaments of words." Fundamental to governance is the possession of a stable yardstick. Of course, a yardstick which is continually expanding or contracting is no yardstick at all. We're familiar with the material world, the mundane world, where quite rightly we deem a particular action to be good under certain circumstances and bad under others, or where one action is considered to be right and its opposite right at a different time. But all of these judgments we make imply, sitting behind the change, a overarching goodness against which particular actions and circumstances are judged. Timaeus' distinction between that which is and that which is coming to be is absolutely fundamental here. The mark of a philosopher is that she is always in pursuit of that which is. But this is knowledge, not opinion. The object of knowledge is what the philosopher pursues. Opinion can only see what is coming to be. Plato in the Republic, and indeed in other dialogues, makes the quite unambiguous claim that knowledge is infallible, since its object is pure being. shorn of any obscuring matter, and above the movement that's intrinsic to the world of generation. Knowledge, if we're using it in its strictest sense, is always true, as opposed to opinion, which can be true, but can also be false, and often partly true and partly false. So, for example, we may believe the sun goes round the earth, but we can't know that the sun goes round the earth because it doesn't. It's a major problem for human beings to work out whether their belief is true or not. And we often mistake beliefs for knowledge. But that's Plato's position, and indeed the Platonic tradition's position. Knowledge is always true. But for knowledge to be infallible, not only must the object of knowledge be stable, but we must have some form of thinking which is equally stable, which is equally shorn of the movement which is intrinsic to the flow of the material world. This is difficult. So much of our thinking is tied to images, whether those images are the fleeting glimpse of forms in matter, or the objects which appear in our imagination, or in the opinion that has passed from others to our own thinking, or whether it is, if you like, representations of truth in the process of reasoning. For Platonists, reason has a value, and it's to be exercised, but its value is where it takes the soul. The steps in reasoning lead, if it's followed far enough, to a place where stillness reigns, where the steps stop. Those steps take us to a contemplative moment, in a way out of time. In Plato's seventh letter, and of course the authorship of all the letters is questioned by some scholars, but let's for the time being say that the seventh letter is by Plato. If not by Plato, then somebody who was very close to him in philosophy. In the seventh letter, there is an outline of our Gnostic progress from the most outward towards the object of real knowledge. He begins with naming, and then goes through definition, and then the inspection in the outer world of resemblances of the idea that one is pursuing, and onwards. So let me just read the passage that this comes in. There are three things belonging to each of those particulars through which knowledge, episteme, is necessarily produced. But the fourth is knowledge itself, and it is requisite to establish as the fifth that which is known and true. One of these is the name of a thing, the second its definition, the third the resemblance, the fourth knowledge. But the fourth is science and intellect and true opinion about these. But among the number of these, intellect, by its relation and similitude, proximately adheres to the fifth, while the rest are more remote from its nature. This alignment between the intellect which we participate in and the object of knowledge is really beyond speech and beyond writing. The philosopher must find within herself the object of knowledge, the letter also says, neither receptivity nor memory will ever produce knowledge in him who has no affinity with the object, since it does not germinate to start with in alien states of mind. So the alignment of what is in the human soul with what is in reality is a living alignment, and the patient, laborious path to those moments where we step, so to speak, out of time is the subject of several passages of Plato and other writers. A good example is in the Symposium, where Socrates reports on the speech of Diotima, in many ways an initiatory passage. And this is her description of the seeker finally coming across beauty itself.
Whoever then is advanced thus far in the mysteries of love, by a right and regular progress of contemplation, approaching now to perfect intuition, suddenly he will discover, bursting into view, a beauty astonishingly admirable. That very beauty, to the gaining a sight of which the aim of all his preceding studies and labours had been directed. A beauty whose peculiar characters are these. In the first place, it never had a beginning, nor will ever have an end, but always is, and always flourishes in perfection, unsusceptible of growth or of decay. It resides not in any other being, not in any animal, for instance, nor in the earth, nor in the heavens, nor in any other part of the universe, but, simple and separate from other things, it subsists alone with itself, and possesses an essence eternally uniform.
The Republic has a scheme of education for those being brought up to the point where they can govern the city. And we have to remember that the Republic is constantly running on this parallel analogy, if you like, between the city with all its classes of people and its activities, and the soul with its many powers and activities. So the scheme of education really is applicable to us as individuals as we attempt to bring our governing part to the point where it can govern properly. So the scheme of education is designed to move the governors, the potential governors, into the sphere of knowledge, where they discover a stable root within themselves, which is able to contact unchanging being. The lover of learning, those that are being educated towards governance, the lover of learning, says Socrates, does not cease from his love of truth till he comes into contact with the nature of everything which is, by that part of the soul which is allied to real being. The infallibility of knowledge rests upon this simple, non-relative state in which the being of both the knower and the known are brought together into contact. The experience is to pass out of the temporal realm and into the eternal realm insofar as that's possible for us. Plato often signals this moment with a particular word, exaphnes, which is often translated as suddenly. For while the preparation for the contact may be long and laborious, years, possibly lifetimes of endeavour, but the moment there is a contact of real being to real being, that is a timeless moment. And it's transformative. It transforms the life and it transforms the soul by a recovery of herself. So the discursive path, the path of reasoning, is always seen as valuable because that's where it's leading to. And there is a recognition that this is not a dry abstraction. We actually have to live it. We have to live the path if we are to reach that point of touching truth, touching reality, touching being. Again, going back to the seventh letter, this is what Plato writes concerning this moment. For a thing of this kind cannot be expressed by words like other disciplines, but by long familiarity, and living in conjunction with the thing itself, a light, as it were, leaping from a fire, will, on a sudden, be enkindled in the soul, and there itself nourish itself. Since knowing and being are one, it's clear that in knowing the self, one becomes oneself, and becoming oneself, one knows oneself. I can't emphasize enough the difference between a Platonic approach to knowing oneself and the modern, more or less materialistic view of discovering oneself. The effect of knowing oneself is to simplify the life, to bring about a awakening of providential service to the rest of the universe, or at least that corner of the universe that we have influence over, as opposed to the modern discovering oneself, which all too often is a selfish, self-centered thing which merely aims at a kind of comfortable life. But enough of this criticism. The path of arete, the path of virtue that the Platonic philosophy requires of us, begins with an ordering of the world around us, the material world around us. We give it due measure. We bring to bear on it reasons. We beautify it and we order it as best we can. But that's just the start. The next step, if you like, is inwards, where we order ourselves. We bring due measure to our powers. We bring order and beauty to ourselves, so that we begin to purify ourselves from the illusion that we are our instruments, or that we are the passions that are aroused by contact with the outside world. All of those, of course, have their place, but we do have to purify ourselves from the illusion that that's us. So that's a purifying process, and the end result of that purifying process is that we then become much more readily aligned with eternal principles, and we move into, if you like, a third phase of the virtuous life in its proper sense of the word, where we contemplate the eternal realities of the world of real being. Proclus, in his commentary on the Timaeus, has a rather beautiful passage which takes us through those stages. This is what he says. For it is necessary that the soul, which is hurled like a seed into the realm of generation, should lay aside the stubble and bark, as it were, which she obtained from being disseminated into these fluctuating realms, and that, purifying herself from everything circumjacent, she should become an intellectual flower and fruit, delighting in an intellectual life, instead of an opinionative nutriment, and pursuing the uniform and simple energy of the period of sameness, instead of the abundantly wandering motion of the period which is characterized by difference. The Platonic understanding of arete, virtue, is key to the living of the Platonic life. Arete, virtue or excellence, is the power by which the essential nature is brought to full manifestation. It's the means by which a creature becomes truly itself. We'll look at that more closely in videos to come, but for the present it's necessary to point out that virtue is not an activity, it's not an exterior activity in itself, it's not even a pattern of thought, it is the very essence of the soul brought to its fullness. This is perhaps signalled by the rather startling assertion made by Plotinus in his treatise on virtue, where he says, "The endeavour is not to be without sin, but to be a god. For the core of our being is something divine. If by arete we can bring that essence of essence, so to speak, into full manifestation, we pass beyond the merely deliberative, the merely discursive, and all our actions and thoughts will necessarily be good, some ideal towards which we aim." This divine core is best understood perhaps as our counterpart to the wellspring of divinity which lies behind or within, above, real being. Transcendent in its simplicity, all fore-reaching in its immanence, it is the signature, if you like, of the first principle, whether we call it the One, or the Good, or God, or any other title. This signature within everything is divine. We need to look at this a little more closely. It's something that Plato is reluctant to bring too far out into the open, and it falls to the lot of later Platonists, the so-called Neoplatonists. It's a terrible label, but that's what they're called nowadays. The Neoplatonists brought a discussion of these highest principles more clearly into their texts for historical reasons, which I'll look at in the next video. We've seen already in the Republic that Plato has suggested that unless we know the good, all our possessions, all our resources, including our innermost resources, will be more or less useless. And this prompts Glaucon to say, well, in that case, tell us what the good is. Socrates is reluctant. He will not say what the good itself is. What he will talk about is the idea of the good, if you like, an intermediary between that which really cannot be spoken of and all the other forms, such as the form of justice, the form of circle, the form of horse, which go to make up the which have real being, and they're intelligible, and they make up, if you like, the foundation of what's known as Plato's theory of forms. So this idea of the good is something which transcends that, which, if you like, sits at the peak of the world of being, the world of ideas. So Socrates refuses to say what the good is. He says, "I'm afraid I shall not be able, and by appearing readily disposed I shall incur the ridicule of the unmannerly. But, O blessed man, let us present dismiss this inquiry, what the good is. I could wish that both I were able to give that explanation and you receive it." So instead, Plato agrees to talk about the idea of the good. And he introduces an analogy of the idea of the good to the sun. The sun gives light. It makes everything in this earthly world visible. It does more than that. By its warmth, its power, it also brings things into existence. So all visible things are given both their visibility and their very existence by the sun. And this he compares to the idea of the good. And this is what he actually says. "That, therefore, which imparts truth to what is known, and dispenses the power to him who knows, you may call the idea of the good, being the cause of knowledge and truth, as being known through intellect. And as both these two, knowledge and truth, are so beautiful, when you think that the good is something different and still more beautiful than these, you shall think aright. Knowledge and truth here, in the world of real being, are as light and sight there, in the material world, which we rightly judge to be solar form, but that we were not to think that they were the sun. So here it is right to judge that both these partake of the form of the good, but to suppose that either of them is the good is not right, but the good itself is worthy of still greater honour. We may say, therefore, that things which are known have not only this from the good, that they are known, but likewise that their being and essence are thence derived, whilst the good itself is not essence, but beyond essence, transcending it both in dignity and in power. Given these assertions, it's obvious why Socrates refuses to speak about the good. If it's the supplier of essence, the very being, of intelligibility, of truth and knowledge, it itself must be above these. It itself must be unspeakable, unthinkable, and beyond all the conditions which allow the mind to think about things. This very transcendence gives it a power to hold its place in everything without distinction. It's equally in the whole as in the part. It's equally in the universal as in the particular. It's in the living and in the non-living. And yet, none of these characteristics can be attributed to that first principle. It's supremely unaffected by the busyness of being, whether that being is eternal being or whether that being is the coming to be of temporal things. The upward trajectory of the philosophic path takes us through being to what lies behind. Beyond contemplation, if you like, towards union. Perhaps I'll leave you with the words of Plotinus, who does permit himself to speak about this ultimate goal of the philosophic path. For God also is something which is not essence, but beyond essence. Hence the soul, when in this condition, associates with him. He, therefore, who perceives himself to associate with God, will have himself the similitude of him, and if he passes from himself as an image to the archetype, he will then have the end of his progression. But when he falls from the vision of God, if he again excites the virtue which is in himself, and perceives himself to be perfectly adorned, he will again be elevated through virtue, proceeding to intellect and wisdom, and afterwards to the principle of all things. This, therefore, is the life of the gods, and of divine and happy men, a liberation from all terrene concerns, a life unaccompanied with human pleasures, and a flight of the alone to the alone.